the creak of a wooden floor. There is a century that history loves to romanticize. The 1800s, the age of empire, of invention, of elegance. Ball gowns that swept marble floors, hair pinned in perfect formations. Women who moved through the world like porcelain figures, untouched by anything ordinary. But behind the corsets, behind the silk, behind the practiced stillness, there was a life history almost never talks about. A life of silence, of invisible labor, of endurance so quiet it left almost no record at all. This is that story. The 19th century gave the Western world extraordinary things. Indoor plumbing, the germ theory of disease, public health systems, the flush toilet. Inventions that changed the course of human life. And yet, for most women, most ordinary, breathing, living women, none of it arrived when history says it did. The gap between what was invented and what women actually had was enormous. And the gap between what they endured and what history chose to remember was wider still. The doom with the reality history tried hardest to erase. Menstruation. The one experience shared by half the human population across every century, in every corner of the world, and almost entirely absent from the historical record. Disposable sanitary pads did not exist until the 1890s, and even then, they were expensive, unfamiliar, and rarely used. What women had was cloth, rags torn from old linen, old cotton, whatever could be folded, shaped, and held in place, pinned beneath layers of heavy fabric, worn through the day, through work, through society, through everything. Then washed, in private, in silence, dried out of sight, stored out of sight, and used again the following month, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. Water had to be carried from a well or a pump, heated over fire, used sparingly. To wash a single blood-stained cloth in a world without running water was not a minor inconvenience. It was labor. It was planning. It was something that consumed time and energy and required careful thought in a world that pretended it wasn't happening at all. A process the world depended on that it refused to acknowledge. The clothing that carried everything. Then there was the body itself, and the clothing built around it. The corset, the great symbol of Victorian femininity, was not worn the way we imagine. It was not put on for an evening, laced carefully, then removed. For many women, it was worn for days, sometimes weeks, barely removed at all. Beneath it, layers of fabric did what bathing could not. The chemise, a simple garment of cotton or linen, worn directly against the skin. It was not a fashion choice. It was a hygiene system. It absorbed the sweat, the oils, the daily reality of a living body, and it was washed while the outer clothing was not. Because the outer clothing could not be washed easily. Heavy wool, structured silk, fabric that would warp, shrink, or fall apart in water. The chemise was the barrier between the body and everything else. A silent, invisible solution, worn and washed and worn again, that no one spoke of. The labor of bathing. Bathing, as we understand it, daily, private, effortless, did not exist. For most people in the 1800s, a full bath was weekly, for many, monthly, for some, even rarer. This was not neglect, this was reality. Water had to be heated over fire, carried in buckets, poured into a shallow basin or tin tub, used, then carried out again. Bathing was labor, and that labor, like most domestic labor, fell on women. And the women who did the most washing were often the ones who bathed the least. Part 5. Hair, teeth, and the invisible details. Even the details history glosses over carried weight. Hair, long, dense, heavy. The elaborate styles of the Victorian era were not vanity alone. They were practical solutions to a practical problem. Hair that could not be washed easily was styled instead, kept clean through dry methods, brushed, scented, pinned. Washing it could take hours, and so most women washed it once a week, many less. And teeth. No toothpaste as we know it. Tooth powder, chalk, charcoal, rubbed on with cloth or a rough brush. Sugar consumption was rising through the century. Decay followed closely behind. And dentistry in this era was something people avoided for as long as they possibly could. When industry arrived. Later in the century, things began to change. Public water systems, sewage infrastructure, public baths open to the working class. Progress, real progress. But access was never equal, and for women, it was almost always delayed. And then came something else entirely, the hygiene industry. New products arrived, promising cleanliness, freshness, correction. Soaps marketed specifically to women, powders, rinses, and with them, something that had never quite existed before: shame. The message was simple, and it was everywhere. The natural female body was a problem, something to be corrected, something to be managed, something to be hidden and sold to. The truth history missed. Warm but still serious. And yet, what those women already possessed was something the new industry never gave them. Knowledge. Generations of it. Passed woman to woman, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, in whispers, in gestures, in the quiet exchange of practical wisdom. The rags that protected them, the chemises that carried their daily lives, the hip baths taken in cold rooms before dawn, the tooth powder they made themselves, the routines built from nothing, from need, from ingenuity, from sheer persistence. Pause. These were not failures. They were not signs of a lesser time. They were solutions, quietly built, carefully maintained, passed down in silence, because the world around them demanded silence. And what really ended, hot water arrived. Modern bathrooms came. Disposable hygiene products filled shelves. And the women who had lived without them, who had carried water and washed rags and endured in careful silence were never remembered for how they managed. Because invisible work leaves no record. It does not appear in the history books. It does not appear in the portraits. It does not appear in the ballroom scenes or the parlor paintings or the romantic novels of the age. But it was there, every single day, in cold rooms, in quiet mornings, in hands that worked before the household woke. That is the real story of women in the 1800s. Not the elegance, not the silence, but the strength that lived inside it. 1.